Hey everybody, I did a short video recently on the ins and outs somewhat of what to look for on a Mopar big block seal retainer, the notorious leaks that everyone seems to encounter, or a lot of people encounter with when rebuilding big block Mopars. The rear main seal leaks are somewhat of an issue. So the video before kind of showed what I did, or what I found, and kind of what I did to correct the retainer interference issue with the number 5 main cap. So in this video I'm going to try to kind of show you what to do to get it set up before you drop the crank in, and to make sure it's lined up, and some ways to mark it and describe it so that once the crank's in and you can't actually see the seal, you'll know that it's lined up correctly. So we've got this seal in the block, the upper half of the seal's in the block, and we've went ahead, we're going to clock it a little bit. So we've got it probably, about 3/16 of an inch down on one side, and of course sticking up on the other side. And you can kind of see how it's above the surface here. So, and then on the retainer, we did just the opposite, okay? And there again, make sure that this part of the seal is facing in toward the block. So on this particular retainer, we've got O-ring side seal, so we're going to just go ahead and install them dry for the dry fit. We're going to go ahead and put these in. This is an aftermarket retainer, and we're going to go ahead and slide this down in place. And these are a little bit long. I've just left them long. It's just so we're keeping it against the main cap, and we're going to take it down until it seats in position over the other half of the seal. Okay, we'll go ahead and drop the bolts in. We'll run these in with the ratchet. Okay, those are pretty snug. So what we've done is we've took a little bit of red layout fluid. As you can see, we've painted a dab at the points where the retainer intersects the block at the top. This will kind of give you alignment forward and aft, and then down here where the two pieces meet, this is your upper half of your block, the retainer. We went ahead and did a little layout fluid, and we scribed a couple of marks on that to give us the side-to-side alignment. So where this retainer and this seal is lined up at right now, they're lined up good. So when we drop the crank back in, when we put the crank in, we can use these marks to make sure that the retainer ends up in the final location where it needs to be to line up the seal halves. So we're going to go ahead and pull it back out. Now, you do want to, I'll add it, you do want to put a very thin coat of sealant. In this case, I'm going to use Loctite 518 anaerobic sealer, but you want a real thin coat on the base of this retainer on each side to seal the block to retainer joint, and then we will seal up the sides. We're going to use these O-rings, and we're going to use some sealer along these sides to seal this in. So we'll go ahead and take the retainer and the seal back out. Also, before I forget, we will use a very small amount of 518 Loctite between the two seal end halves, just to kind of seal them together. So we'll remove the retainer. We'll go ahead and pull this all out. We'll get this lower or upper half of the seal dressed up, cleaned up, and ready to go in, and we're going to drop the crank in. And once I got the crank in, we'll be back to do the final install of the seal upper half and the retainer. The half and the retainer. We'll be back to do that, and we'll see you guys in a little bit. Okay, we're back. We got the crank in, got the main caps on. We've got the upper seal half in the block with it clocked like we showed earlier. So now I'm going to go ahead and install the seal and the retainer, the retainer and the lower seal. And so I've got the seal in the retainer, have it offset the opposite of the side that we offset it on earlier. So we're going to use a little bit of, we're going to put just a dab of assembly lube on the lower half of the seal. We put some on the upper half before we set the crank in. We did lube the seal journal as well to keep from tearing the seal when you turn the crank. So we're going to put a little bit on it, lube it up some. We're using some 5/18 Loctite anaerobic sealer, and we're going to do just a dab of sealer on the very end of the seal, and just a little bit will do. I mean a very little bit, and we'll add just a tidbit on it right there, and we put a little 5/18, a very thin coat of it, where the retainer seats against the block. So this retainer uses the O-rings on the sides. We're going to put the O-rings in. Go ahead and put them in. And we're going to coat the side of the retainer, both sides where it contacts the block. We're going to seal it with some RTV. So we're going to use a little sealer along the edges of it. And this, I'll put this on a little bit thicker than normal, just because I want it to try and fill the gap that's between the retainer and the block. So we'll put a dab up through there. We'll just put it on there. Do that on both sides. And I'm also going to do just a little bit up the side of the block here where the retainer sits. Mostly we're counting on the O-rings to make the seal, but a little bit of RTV there in that spot as well. It'll kind of act as a bit of a lubricant also on the O-rings. And so we made the marks earlier to show how to line it up. I probably should cut some of this off, but I'm not going to. I'll just get it started in there. And it'll make its way where it needs to go. I'll probably want to come around here in the back. We'll just work it down in, block. Just like so. Get the bolts, drop the bolts in. You can see the mark I scribed earlier here is pretty well lined up. So we'll start these bolts in. I got so much clutter on my table, I can't find half of my tools when I need them. I got crap everywhere. So we got them just kind of, they ain't really snug, just ran down, and I can look down in behind the flange here, and I can see the marks that I made for the side to side. They're kind of tough to see on camera, but I can see them, and they are lined up. So I can see my mark here. There we go. So it looks like our marks are lined up exactly where they were. Yep, spot on. And we'll snug this down here. I know there's like a torque spec in the book on how tight to tighten those, but you know, I'm just going to do a good snug tight fit, and then we'll come back to it when we got the torque wrench out again, and I'll torque them one final time after everything has a chance to dry and set up. So now another thing I'll do is I did a little 45 on the corners of this retainer, and so I'm going to just go up the side right here and fill in this 45. Just because I don't want to leak, simply because the retainer ain't sealed up. A leaking seal is, I guess, a struggle to get that correct, but we don't want the retainer to be the problem. And we'll just go ahead and trim these off. The O-rings, the parts that's sticking up, we'll just go ahead and take a razor blade and trim those off flush. And if this seal leaks, I guess we'll try a different manufacturer seal the next go around, and maybe try the factory retainer. But right now we're just gonna let this set up before we turn the crankshaft or anything. We're just gonna give everything time to dry, and I'm probably gonna stand the block up on its end. A fellow forum member on For B-Bodies Only made a recommendation, which is a great idea to save a lot of time on the front end, is just stand the block up on the end, just maybe do it on the flange end and stand it up and fill the area behind the seal with some probably like 5W20 or something, kind of some thin oil, and pour it in there and let it set for, 24 hours or whatever. And if you got any oil leaking around behind the flange, then you need to just go ahead and do it again before you reassemble the whole engine and tear it all back down again. So we'll let this dry a little bit, and we'll be back with you and continue with the build. Hey everybody, we're back again at reassembling this hemi. We did the seal, put the crank in, we've got the main caps torqued. The seal and retainer is in and torqued, and we're just gonna go over dropping a couple of pistons in and putting the rod caps on. I've got 2 pistons already installed. So let's get started. So this piston was already ran, it's pre-ran, and the ring gaps had been checked previously. So most important thing is get everything clean. And I like to use these Chem wipes. They're pretty good wipes. They don't leave a bunch of lint and everything. So I like to use these to clean the parts with as I'm assembling. So we're gonna wipe this down a little bit here and get it good and clean. Go ahead and clean the bearing cap. And you can see, it had a little bit of residue on it. I'm gonna go ahead and wipe the cap, get the cap ready. Now you want to pay attention to the parting lines on these caps. These are aftermarket caps, these are Eagle rods. But on a factory cap, when you disassemble, it's always good to mark the cap mating surfaces here so that you be sure and get them back correctly. If you spin them the wrong way with a factory cap, then they might not be sized correctly. So always, if you're disassembling and just going to reassemble without machine work, always make sure and mark your caps so that you put them back in the right orientation on the rod. So we'll clean the hole out to make sure there's nothing in the hole. We'll get it clean. It's got a little bit of oil, but for the most part it's pretty clean. And we'll clean from the top down. We've got the main journal, or the rod journal, directly below. Come, look down in here and see if you can see the main journal is directly below. Okay, so you got that, and it's as far away as it can get, so it'll give you an opportunity without worrying about hitting when you install the piston and rings in. So the first thing I like to do is just put a real thin film of oil down in the cylinder. The cylinder will all oil it up good. Alright, and then go ahead and oil the piston, the skirts, and a little on the rings. You don't need a whole lot, just a film on it. You don't want it just dripping off of it. I know there's some engine rebuild books will tell you to, dunk them down in clean engine oil, which that's fine if that's what you want to do, I guess, but there's really no need. So now we got the piston lubed up. We're going to go ahead and use a little assembly lube on the cap and the rod. or bearing in the rod half. Put us a coat of that. Alright, we'll set this aside just a second. We'll go ahead and lube up the cap. You definitely don't want to put these together dry. We got the cap lubed. So now we're going to come over here on the rod journal. On the particular one we're working with, so you always want to clean from the top down. So we cleaned out the cylinder. If anything fell down, of course it's on that rod journal. So we're going to clean the rod journal. Alright, and we're going to go ahead and lube the rod journal with some assembly lube. And there again, you don't have to just gob it on there. It just needs a good coat. Be sure and also do the sides of the rod journal where the rods they'll be rubbing on the sides as you're turning it, so it's always a good idea to put a little on the side flange as well. Okay, so we got that lubed. Everything's lubed up. Now you want to be sure and clock your ring gaps so that they're not lined up. This is your top ring, top compression ring. I like to not line those up 90 degrees to the pin. And so the second compression ring will line its groove up 360 degrees from the top one. So you can see that ring gap there, and this is your top ring gap. Now on your oil ring, you want those staggered top and bottom too. You got two oil rings. You got an upper and lower oil ring. You just don't ever want to line it. This piston here is a stroker piston, so it don't have any. There's really a little bit of a piston gone right here, so the oil ring is not really supported right there in that spot. It's really not an issue. So we just make sure that these are about 360 degrees apart and not lined up with the pin. So we got all that set up. So we've got this tapered ring compressor, which is the greatest tool ever. I mean, it's bore size specific, obviously, but it makes short work of dropping pistons in. You just drop this in. You want to reach up here and under the bottom where you can feel the rod to kind of control it a little bit and get it started in the hole. Once it's started in the hole, square your piston up. Make sure it's clear. And I just take a small mallet, small hammer. This is like a dead blow, and gently tap this in. If you feel any resistance at all during this process, stop and find out why. And once your rings are clear and are down in the cylinder bore, you can remove your tool. And you can see we're basically at the top dead center on this piston, and it is the rings are all down in. So at this point I like to take the same mallet. You can push it by hand somewhat, but it's not as controlled, I don't think, as a tap, so I like to kind of tap it in. We just want to make sure we clear if you come around here you can kind of see. You just want to make sure you clear the crank throws with your rod as you're coming down to the rod journal. So just tap it gently like. And don't get in no hurry, because you don't want to bang this rod into the crank journal. Now on factory rods, they have a stud. It's a good idea to get some rubber hose and cover your studs so that you don't scar the crank. And once it's down and seated, get the cap. Now you want to make sure there again that you orient this cap correctly. On these aftermarket caps, there's a couple of ways to identify which way it goes on the rod. Number one is, I don't know if they're easy to show up in the camera, but there's some numbering right here, and there's also some numbering on the rod as well. But if you look at the way the cap's made, you got this shorter radius and you got this longer radius. Those match up on the rod. The rod has the matching radiuses, so you want to be sure you get it oriented correctly. Now this is the second time I've built this engine. I've had to take it back apart for that rear main seal problem. I could have done it with, you know, probably the pistons and rods in it, but I'm a one-man show, so I'd have had to be very genius on like how to get the rods back and crank back in without damaging everything. So once you've got the bolts started or the nuts, depending on what type of rod you have, go ahead and you want to take these evenly. You don't want to try to tighten one side all at once. Just take them down evenly till they bottom. Okay, now I'm going to be coming back to these after I get all the pistons and rods installed. I'll be coming back to each one of these and removing the bolts and putting ARP assembly lube on them and torquing them to the proper torque specs. So that's a piston install. I'm going to go ahead and get the rest of them in, and we'll move on to camshaft next, I guess, and that's all for now, and we'll see you in a few. So we're back again, and we went ahead and installed the camshaft and set up the timing marks, and we've already degreed the camshaft. We did that before we did that the first time we built the engine. We did all the degreeing of the camshaft, which you know, you can buy a camshaft and plug it in there, and I guess set up the factory marks and run it. But to get the maximum gain out of the camshaft, you always need to degree it. So I just wanted to kind of show, which I'm sure most of you guys and gals that work on Mopar engines know the whole ordeal with the timing marks on the timing gear, on the cam gear and the crank gear. Like on a small block Chevy, you line them up. If you look here, you would normally line them up. This is the dot. This is a advance or retard. It's got all the notches, the different keyway notches, so you can advance or retard. I think it's like 2 degrees between each one of these. You can do that with this particular gear. But like on a Chevy and some of the maybe like how to rebuild big block Mopar engines, I think I've saw it in there. There's like it's kind of misleading. It tells you to line these dots up at 6 on the cam gear and 12 o'clock on the crank gear. I mean, you can time it that way, but on a Mopar, you want your crank gear at 12 o'clock and the notch, the dot, whatever it is on your cam gear at 12 o'clock. Those need to be lined up. That's on the firing stroke. So if you line it up dot to dot per se, kind of like Chevys, then you're on the exhaust, the top of the exhaust. So just spin it around until you get this mark at the top, this mark at the top, and this piston at top dead center number 1, and you will be top dead center on the firing stroke. So I just wanted to kind of go over that little tidbit of info, and you can see I drilled this cam gear and I put a bushing in it to advance it. I set this one up at 108 degrees, so we're going to move on with putting the timing cover on. We'll go ahead and get it bolted up, and go ahead and get this torqued down, bolt this up, and we'll be ready for the water pump and the harmonic balancer. So we'll be back with you for another tidbit on that, and see you later. Well, I got the timing cover installed, and I'm going to be removing this center piece here to set the camshaft in play. This cover here is a really nice cover. I got this cover from AR Engineering. Andy did an excellent job with these covers. They're a bit expensive, but they're well worth the price if you're running a roller camshaft in a big block Mopar. Basically, you take this cover off. I'll kind of show you what we got here. It comes with this. That's a pretty nice little setup. It's got this cover has O-rings. It's a double O-ring under this cover, so no gaskets or sealing or anything to clean off and redo and buy and all that. It's a pretty nice setup. It also comes with a plate that bolts back in place of this cover. It has a slot in it. I'll see if I can locate it real quick like here, and give you a good idea of how it works. Give me just a second here. Let me find a pick. Okay, you can see the cover has 2 O-rings, and of course you can also see the camshaft, or the crank cam gear. You got the ARP bolts, did the offset bushing. Let me grab the button right here. Got the button, cam button. So I had to do some clearance notches in this button. It comes just round, so depending on what kind of bolts you use to attach your camshaft, that's kind of what you got to do, is clearance it so that it fits correctly. So this one here, I got to check this one, because whenever you replace the gasket and use a different gasket, or if you can't get the exact same thickness gasket on the timing cover, if you need to remove it and replace it, if you can't reuse your gasket you had the end play set to, then you got to check it, or in some cases, if it's a thicker gasket, you just pick up a new button and just readjust it. So let me find the cover and I'll be right back with you. Okay, so I got the cover. It's a pretty good idea. It's pretty genius, really. I'm kind of trying to do this with one hand here. One hand and hold the camera and get screws started, get them in the socket, all that good jazz. It's kind of tough. My cameraman's not here right at the moment, so we're just gonna wing it. This is a really good idea. This is one of the nicest covers for a roller cam that I've seen available. You can take the, of course you can use a heavier duty aluminum cover and try to, set your end play with one of those heavy covers. But this cover here is really nice because the factory water pump housing clears this just fine. There's no clearance issues with it. So we'll get this snug down and I'll show you kind of how you do this. You just want to snug these down until they stop. Don't want to over tighten them. O-ring fits are, once the O-ring is squeezed, any over tightening of these bolts are it's useless. That's with any O-ring gasket. So we got that installed, so we'll go ahead here and one-handed. I'll kind of just give you an example of how you check your end play with this cover. Of course, we got some feeler gauges here, and with one hand I'm probably not going to be able to measure it exactly, but I can give you somewhat of an idea. You just kind of see what your clearance is by slipping the feeler gauge down in between the cover and the cam button, and we'll play big with that one. I apologize for my crappy camera work here, doing the feeler gauges with one hand. I'll try to get an idea here of what we got before I stop the video. So we got more than 8. So anyway, you get the idea. It's a pretty nice cover, and it looks pretty good too. So has a part number here. It's AR224, AR Engineering. So, and it's got a really nice indicator for your timing, fully adjustable. So anyway, that's that for the timing cover. I did get the fuel pump installed. So moving right along, I'll be back with you guys in a few. Okay, so I'm back. We got the timing cover done. We've got the camshaft in play set with the button. Here's the old button. Since we used a different thickness gasket here, this one was about 10 or so thousandths thicker than the first gasket we used, so it made this button was a little bit, I could have put a shim behind it, I guess, of some sort, and shimmed it out a little bit, but I just went ahead and bought a new one. Cheap as they are, it made sense. It didn't take me long to get it set, but I've got that clearance set at 8 thousandths on that. And we've got it rolled over here, and we're going to do the oil pan gaskets. We're going to go ahead and install the oil pan. I've got the rods and the mains all torqued. So I cleaned this surface good with brake clean. Got all the oil residue off of it. So over to the windage tray. What I did on the windage tray was I went ahead and I cleaned it up and cleaned it with brake clean where the gasket locates, and used some adhesive, and went ahead and glued the gasket to both sides, which takes 2 gaskets for the windage tray. I glued gaskets to both sides of the windage tray, and that just keeps you from having to fight both of them and line them both up. And that's really useful if you're doing this under the car, if you're having to do a pan change, or you need to drop the pan for any reason, or you know, you want to replace the gaskets. They do make a one-piece composite type windage tray that, you know, its gaskets are integrated into it, that some people have used. It seems like it works pretty well, but I didn't want to spend the money, so I already had the windage tray, so I just got a couple of gaskets and cleaned the pan up. On the pan, you want to make sure that you recess, you know, take like a ball peen or something and check the rail on this pan and make sure that there's no high spots where it's been torqued down before. This will be high, so you want to get all those flush. Make sure your pan rails are straight, and once you do that and you get it sitting good and flat, then it's merely just a time to install it. So when you install it, you want to put, now I don't use sealer all along this block on the pan rail on the block. I don't use sealer all along that. I do put a little bit of RTV at these junctions here for the timing cover, and I put some RTV here at the junction of the rear main seal retainer. And it's probably a good idea to just go ahead and fill this in as well with RTV where these bolts are recessed. So, and another thing is, on a factory retainer, these 2 bolt holes are more shallow than, they're not as deep as your bolts in your block, your bolt holes in your block. So make sure that you don't put bolts in that will bottom out, because usually what it does is bust through the back side of the retainer, and then you got a place for oil to leak around the threads of this bolt. Just make sure that these 2 bolts are shorter out of all the oil pan bolts. So we're going to go ahead. I don't have the cameraman here to, you know, help me out on showing you the whole install of this, but I've went over it, and we're just going to go ahead and get this pan put in place, and we'll be right back. One thing I want to mention is, if you use main studs in the block, as you can see here, I've made some clearance holes in the windage tray, because your windage tray will bottom out on these studs, and it'll hold it up off of the surface right here, and you'll have a leak back here that you'll blame on the rear main seal. You'll be saying that's the issue, when a lot of these rear main seal leak issues that we have, I think some of them are due to the fact that it's leaking around this retainer, because when you use studs, main studs, you need to make sure and clearance the windage tray for the studs, because they do stick up quite a bit higher than the factory bolts. So just wanted to add that in and kind of show you what it looks like before I bolt this pan on. And sometimes you want to make sure that your pan is not going to hit these as well. because if your pan bottoms out against the back of these, it'll usually hit right on the rear edge of the stud here, right where the pan turns up. So you just want to make sure that your pan is not hitting those, because it will show up like a rear main seal leak. So we'll be back with the pan installed. Okay, we're back. We're going to, we've done got one cylinder head installed. I'm going to go ahead and just kind of go over installing the last one. So I cleaned everything up real good with brake clean. I got the head surface on the block really clean. I got the gaskets ready. I got the head clean. See the head right here? Got the head cleaned up, ready to go. So on the gasket, on a hemi, this is a Chromatic multi-layer gasket, and if you kind of look, see, you can see that I've went ahead and did a really light skim coat of RTV around the water ports. Chromatic recommends no sealant be used on their multi-layer steel head gaskets, but I've had a little bit of experience with Hemis, enough to know that they're notorious to leak around these ports to the outside. So I always just put a very fine bead of ultra red Permatex around the water ports on the head gaskets, and also I'll put just a little bit of high tack around the surface right here on the oil return drains. So I've got the two water ports in the bottom side of the cylinder wall. I've got RTV on those, so that'll mate up to these. So we're going to go ahead with the install on this. So we'll go ahead and place the head gasket on, and we'll do just a little bit of RTV on the other side of this. And I mean, I use just a the lightest coat I can possibly put on this is what I do. I mean, just very light, just enough to have just a little bit of the stuff in there. If you use too much of this, it'll squeeze out all over the head gasket. I mean, when you torque these down, the torque value is the final torque on these with the ARP studs is 80 foot-pounds. So if you use too much, it will squeeze out everywhere. So you want to put a very light coat of this on. Almost like a, just about a see-through coat. So one thing I almost forgot to do and it's not too late to go ahead and do it. It's like I mentioned before, I like to use a little bit of just a real small, as light a coat as I can put on it of Permatex High Tack around the oil return ports, because they are notorious for leaking oil around the drain back on these. So I just put a real light coat on them. Just a little insurance is all. You don't want to get too carried away with that because it'll squeeze out inside your oil return and restrict your oil drain back. And that's something you really don't want with a Hemi. So now we got that upper side of the head gasket prepped, and I've got the head. We went ahead and put some RTV around the lower water jacket ports. So we went ahead and did that. You want to always remember to use some kind of thread sealant on these 4 studs or bolts because they go directly into the intake ports. So they'll suck right there. They'll suck oil up through them. And you'll wonder where the oil leak is, and it'll be around them studs. So you always want to use some thread sealant on those 4 studs. So we're going to do just another small layer of high tack here around the oil returns on the upper side of the gasket. Just very little bit. I do go back with some brake clean and like a long Q-tip, a long clean Q-tip, and I will clean out what excess of this high tack squeezes out into the oil return galley. So now we'll go ahead and set the head on. Now I'll give you a little bit of info on using head studs with a Hemi head. Is if you've never done it before, you will install those 4 studs in the head, and then you'll come over and you'll put all your studs in the block, and you'll have everything ready to go, and you'll slip your head gasket on there. Then when you go to drop the head down over all the studs, it won't go. These 4 studs in the back here, they keep it from going. So just install the 4 studs, put the head gasket on, get everything ready, set your head on, and then drop your studs in after. So I'm gonna grab a latex glove here. I have ARP assembly lube all over these things. We'll go ahead and get these nuts started, get them run up. And it's always best to just use the ARP lubricant that ARP recommends you use. I mean, you buy the kit from them, it always comes with a little squeeze pack of lubricant, so you might as well use the Molly lube. Caterpillar makes some really good Molly lube, but if you don't have it, just use the ARP. It's the same stuff, just in a different can. I hope to get it back together and just continue on with this video, and maybe go ahead and just get it on the stand and let you guys hear it run. there'll be quite a bit of time in tuning it. I mean, I probably won't go over all of the details of tuning it, but I will at least follow through with this video so you guys can hear it run. On the ARP recommends that you only hand tighten these studs, and this little ratchet, greatest tool ever. I use it more than probably anything in the shop. And when it stops, I don't tighten it anymore. I just kind of let the studs go down. They're not bottoming out. Now, next thing you want to do is I went ahead and wipe these clean, set them on this newspaper. We want to go ahead and drop the rocker gear down on the head. Goes on a hemi. The head bolt, the head studs or bolts, whatever you use, are the same ones that hold this rocker gear on. We'll go ahead and run these down. I got to torque these at 80 foot-pounds, and ARP recommends 3 equal steps, so I try to get them as close as I can to. I don't split them perfect 3 ways, but I'll do about 25 and then 50 and then 80. That'll get me pretty close to where I want to be. So the first thing I do is just go over them and snug them up just a little by hand with just a breaker bar. I just put a few pounds of torque on them, not much at all. And I'll normally just snug them up just to get them bottomed out. Because you want to do the correct torque sequence on them. Prevent any leaks, head gasket failures. This just kind of gets it seated. And so if you're deciding to do some work on a hemi and you got one you're going to work on, you're going to rebuild, you're going to have one of these torque adapters. That's a 1/2 inch torque adapter. Because it's so close here, you can see you'll never get a ratchet or a torque wrench down there to them, so you got to use this little torque adapter. And you also need to do a calculation on the length center to center on this, and then from the center of your ratchet to the center of where your handle is, and there's a formula so you can adjust it properly. For example, when we do 25 foot-pounds on these, with this torque adapter, we'll be setting the torque wrench to 22.5 pounds when we're using this. So we'll go ahead and start with 25. And the pattern is, this is always the first one. This is number 1. It's number 2. Number 3. And number 4, we'll have to use this adapter. So we'll go ahead and change it back to 22.5. This is number 4. This is number 4. Number 5. This will be number 6 right here. Number 7. Number 8. Once we get up a little bit higher, we'll have two wrenches. This, my big snap on don't go no lower than 50. This is number 9. This is number 10. Number 11. Number 12. $13, $14, this is 14. Was it 14? $15. This was number 15. This is 16. And 17. If I didn't lose count. I know I got them all. Yep, 17. So the next step will be go up to 50. So we'll go ahead and take our torque setting up to 50. And we'll go over them again. That's number 1. Number 2. Number 3. Now we'll go down to 47 on our torque for our torque adapter. This is number 4. Number 5. So back up to 50 the wrench. And this is number 6. Number 7. Number 8. This will be number 9. Number 10. Number 11. Number 12. $13. $14. This is 15. 16 and 17. So that's got it in 2 steps. We're just going to go ahead and take them on to 80. We won't do that on the video. That should be sufficient for you to kind of see how the pattern goes and the steps to torquing them. So we'll be back with you after we get the head on and move on to something else. Thanks. Something else I wanted to mention here about the rocker stands on a hemi. If you can see, let me get you a bigger view here, see if we can see them all. This one and this one have oil holes in them that gets oil up to the rocker shafts. So don't get them mixed up. These can be mixed up. So you're going to probably have, I think maybe all 4 of these could be swapped around. Obviously this one's made totally different. It'd be hard to mix it up. But just make sure if you disassemble these rockers, or even if you get them assembled from somebody, make sure that you see the oil holes and get the right pedestals, the right stands, and the right location for the oil holes. If you don't, you won't get any oil or enough oil to your rockers to the top end. Another thing I wanted to kind of mention, or I did want to mention and show you guys I did, the way that Big Block Mopar's oil is through the number 4 cam journal. And it's what you would call timed oiling. So it's not full-time oiling. If you can see this ridge right here, this ridge right here, that's where the oil galleys go up to the heads to feed oil to the heads. That gets oiled in a timed fashion as the camshaft turns. It comes up from the number 4 cap, and then it's got like a Y shape to the holes drilled in the camshaft. Anyway, as they line up, it squirts oil up to each head back and forth. And now on a Hemi and other Big Block Mopars, there's a groove in the camshaft that'll give it somewhat full-time oiling per se all the time, but it's not a very big groove. But if you're doing an engine prime on a build and you put your priming tool in the hole in the oil pump and you have oil filter and everything, prime your filter, pour some oil in your filter, screw it on. And when you're priming the engine, don't freak out. You'll be like, oh man, we ain't getting no oil to the heads. We've spun the engine around and we still ain't getting no oil to the heads. Well, you gotta turn it real slow by hand. And it usually helps if you got a helper turning the engine real slow by hand. But really a cool thing to do if you're doing a build is you can go ahead and find where that's lined up at before you put the heads on. You can look down in this galley and see the cam and the bearing and the oil hole and get somebody to help you. And you can take a flashlight and look down that galley and have them turn the engine real slow till that lines up. Well, if you do that, when it lines up, you can come down here on your balancer and you can make you a mark so that you know exactly where those are lined up. That's where it's lined up at for the left-hand bank. Now, you can be in this position and it not be lined up. So if you don't get any oil, just spin it another 360 and come back to this and you'll be correct. So I did it there for the left-hand bank and here for the right-hand bank. It's kind of upside down, but you can see it. And what I did was I took, so when I removed this tape, I punched a couple of numbers right where that lines up at with a punch so that later I can come back, I can find it. So I just want to give you those few tips. All right, we'll be back in a second. All right, we're back again, and we've got the heads on, valve covers are on, we've got the intake on and sealed up. So we've bolted on the flywheel, got the mid plate, and the bell housing installed. So the next thing I'm going to do here is we're going to go ahead and torque the harmonic balancer bolt in the front of the crank. We're going to torque it. I made this tool here that you can kind of see the end of it sticking out. It bolts into the 2 flywheel bolt holes, and this is a way just to hold the engine from turning when I torque it. This gets torqued at 135 foot-pounds. So I just had it tight to rotate the engine when I was doing the valve lash and stuff like that, so I could spin the engine around. This is some ARP assembly lube. I'm going to apply a little of that to the threads and the washer and the bolt head so that I get an accurate torque on this bolt. We didn't do like a video on doing the intake, but I will add it into this. I'll go back over these all and torque them. The hemi intakes are notorious for taking a while to take a set on the gaskets. The way they wedge in between the heads and the bolt heads go straight down in it versus at the same plane as most intake wedge intakes. It takes a little while for them to take a set. We've got our torque wrench set to 135 foot-pounds. And those washers, you need to get the thickest washer you can get. Because they're bad to bend, so you don't want to use a thin washer on a Mopar harmonic balancer bolt. So that has that torque. We've got oil in it. We have oil primed it. So I will be checking the run out on the bell housing. We'll go ahead and get that adjusted and make sure that's good before I move any farther with putting it on the engine stand this time. So we'll have that worked out and have the clutch in it. And like I said, when we come back, when we get on the engine stand, I'll go back over re-torquing, going back over that intake manifold. So that's it for now. I'll catch you in a few.